For sexual selection for moral virtues, virtue signaling seems simple at first glance, but there's a lot more depth to it than just people pretending to be better than they really are by showing off their consumer choices and political attitudes. To understand the depth, you have to go back in time to the evolutionary origins of moral virtues themselves. Those origins aren't obvious. It takes a bit of digging to get to their roots. This essay is my deepest dive into the origins of virtue, and it's the intellectual heart of this book. It's also the longest essay by far, the most systematic, and the most academic, although I tried hard to make the original paper accessible and vivid. If you understand sexual selection for moral virtues, you'll understand the psychological foundations of virtue signaling, all the way from first dates through green consumerism to national politics. I wrote this paper in the run-up to tenure, which I got in 2008. I needed a major theoretical paper in a top journal, so my colleagues would take me seriously as a big-picture thinker. I knew that Quarterly Review of Biology, QRB, would be more open to my evolutionary arguments than most psychology journals would be, so I wrote this for them and was thrilled when they accepted it. QRB had published some groundbreaking papers on evolutionary models of altruism in the past that went on to become highly cited. Notably, The Evolution of Reciprocal Altruism by Robert Trivers, published in 1971 and cited over 12,000 times, which is a lot by academic standards. I'd been interested in the origins of human kindness and altruism ever since grad school, and I'd written a bit about it in the 10 years before this paper, including a whole chapter titled Virtues of Good Breeding in my book The Mating Mind from 2000. But I'd never really put those arguments in a systematic, academically serious form until this paper. I tried to integrate everything I'd learned about evolutionary psychology, game theory, signaling theory, altruism, moral philosophy, and romance into this paper. The original paper had about 260 references. I tried to document all the paper's empirical claims as best I could, given the research that was available around 2006 when I was writing this. For readability and brevity, I've stripped out the in-text citations and the bibliography. I've also stripped out the abstract, updated the formatting, and rephrased a few things. Among humans, attractive bodies may inspire short-term desire, but attractive moral traits can inspire long-term love. Is this a coincidence, or are there some functional similarities between sexual ornaments and moral virtues? Many sexually attractive bodily traits evolved to reveal phenotypic condition and genetic quality, including health, fertility, and longevity. This paper explores the possibility that some human moral traits evolved through sexual selection to serve an analogous display function. The most romantically attractive mental traits, kindness, bravery, honesty, integrity, and fidelity, often have a moral dimension. Recent empirical research suggests that many of these moral traits are sexually attractive and can serve as mental fitness indicators. They are judged as reliably revealing good mental health, good brain efficiency, good genetic quality, and good capacity for sustaining cooperative sexual relationships and investing in children. Thus, the moral virtues that we consider sexually attractive are not culturally or evolutionarily arbitrary. Rather, they evolved to advertise one's individual fitness, including genetic quality, parenting abilities, and relationship coordination abilities, in hard-to-fake ways that can be understood through a combination of sexual selection theory and costly signaling theory. Fitness here means adaptive design for reproductive success, or the statistical propensity to survive and reproduce successfully. It may not equal achieved reproductive success under evolutionarily novel conditions in the modern world, especially given contraception. The hypothesis here is that sexual selection shaped at least some of our distinctively human moral virtues as reliable fitness indicators. Precursors of many human moral virtues, such as empathy, fairness, and peacemaking, have been found in other great apes. My claim is not that sexual selection created our moral virtues from scratch in our species alone. Rather, sexual selection amplified our standard social primate virtues into uniquely elaborated human forms. This mate choice model is intended to complement, not replace, other models of human moral evolution. Besides sexual selection, Many other forms of social selection probably shaped human morality, including kin selection, reciprocal altruism, discriminative parental solicitude, commitment mechanisms, risk-sharing mechanisms, social norms and punishment mechanisms, group selection, equilibrium selection among alternative evolutionary strategies. More on that later. Each of these moral evolution models has led to valuable insights and progressive research traditions. Some are better at explaining moral virtues, such as love of children, siblings, and parents, and righteous anger at cheats and promise breakers. This morality through mate choice model also has distinctive strengths and weaknesses that can explain some but not all moral virtues, especially those that show high sexual attractiveness, assortative mating, phenotypic and genetic variants, heritability, condition-dependent costs, conspicuous display in courtship settings, and young adult age peaks in display. Yet for each of the traditional mechanisms above, sexual selection would tend to anticipate, sharpen, and amplify the social selection pressures to produce a more extreme, costly, pro-social version of the moral virtue than social selection could achieve alone. The reason is that non-sexual forms of social selection can shape morality only insofar as they confer fairly concrete survival benefits, such as shared food, protection from predators, on the morally virtuous. Mate choice can shape morality much more powerfully and broadly, because it demands only that moral behaviors carry some signaling value about a potential mate's good genes and/or good parent-partner abilities. In general, sexual selection can supercharge other evolutionary processes by adding just the sort of positive feedback dynamics that tend to trigger evolutionary innovation and speciation. If a moral virtue becomes useful in kinship, reciprocity, or group prosperity, our ancestors probably did not ignore it when choosing mates. Some moral virtues may be attractive as signals, such as heroism as a signal of competence, whereas others may seem attractive as traits in their own right, such as fairness as an intrinsically valuable trait in a long-term sexual relationship. However, this distinction is tricky, because there is almost always scope for misrepresenting one's traits during courtship. A potential mate may act agreeable and easygoing during courtship, then become irritable and cantankerous after a couple of years. In this case, courtship agreeableness was valued as a signal of likely future relationship agreeableness, but it proved an unreliable signal of the trait's temporal stability. Sexual commitment often brings moral disappointment. The costly signaling perspective is helpful in identifying such pitfalls, not only situations where one trait is unreliably correlated with another trait, but also situations where the present value of a trait is unreliably correlated with the future value of that same trait. From this viewpoint, all moral virtues displayed during sexual courtship are potentially fallible signals of other traits or future traits, so their reliability and stability must be analyzed in a costly signaling framework. To suggest that human moral virtues evolved through mate choice is not to suggest that human morality is sexually motivated at the level of individual behavior. Evolutionary functions do not equal proximate motivations. Even if the evolutionary payoffs for moral behavior were mainly reproductive, moral behavior can arise at the proximate level from genuinely moral personalities and motives, not just copulatory motives. Indeed, sexual patience is a key virtue in courtship. If a potential male mate shows sexual self-restraint for a long time, this protects female mate choice and signals that the male is not just looking for a short-term affair or extra-pair copulation. This paper argues that there is substantial overlap between sexually attractive personality traits and human moral virtues, but does not pretend that all sexually attractive traits are virtues, or that all virtues are sexually attractive under all conditions. Some individuals may feel most aroused by potential mates who show Machiavellian cunning, aggressive ferocity, or rampant promiscuity. Human sexuality gets kinky sometimes, and nice guys don't always win. To argue that some moral virtues evolved through mate choice is not to argue that vice is never attractive. Moral virtues and virtue ethics. This paper goes beyond my book, The Mating Mind, by reviewing relevant empirical and theoretical work since 2000, and by integrating relevant insights from individual differences research, behavior genetics, and moral philosophy. For example, it connects recent person perception research with person-level approaches to moral philosophy, especially virtue ethics and naturalistic approaches to understanding moral intuitions. The virtue ethics perspective from philosophy is admittedly not doing much explanatory work in this paper. I do not assume that the virtues historically identified by philosophers will equal the moral adaptations that can be identified in humans using standard adaptationist criteria of special design. Nor do I assume that the idealistic reasons for advocating certain virtues in normative ethics will have anything to do with the nitty-gritty selection pressures that may have actually shaped those virtues phylogenetically. So why mention virtue ethics at all? 4 reasons. First, virtue ethics provides a useful counterbalance to the traditional consequentialist, utilitarian, payoff-based. Ethics have historically influenced previous evolutionary theories of altruism, such as kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Second, as I will argue in a later section, virtue ethics shifts the level of analysis usefully from isolated altruistic acts to stable personality traits. Third, many virtue ethicists write carefully and insightfully about our emotional and cognitive responses to other people's virtues and vices, and their work can be construed as a useful first draft of the qualitative, descriptive moral psychology that may prove useful in understanding the receiver psychology of moral signaling. Fourth, virtue ethics offers a new route whereby evolutionary theory can influence the contemporary humanities and social sciences. We can ask not what virtue ethics can do for us, but what we can do for virtue ethics. Thus, my allusions to virtue ethics are intended in the spirit of maximizing the interdisciplinary relevance of adaptationist research. Costly signaling theory, fitness indicators, and moral virtues. Costly signaling theory has intellectual roots in many traditions and academic fields, some of which construed human moral virtues as costly signals. In Friedrich Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals in 1887, pagan virtues were considered attractive signals of health and power. In Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, conspicuous consumption and conspicuous charity were seen as hard-to-fake signals of wealth and social status. In a seminal 1975 paper, biologist Amat Zahavi viewed many animal signals and pro-social behaviors as hard-to-fake indicators of animal fitness. Since about 1990, costly signaling theory has revolutionized the study of both sexual selection and human altruism. Most animal communication is relentlessly narcissistic, advertising the signaler's own individual species, sex, age, health, fertility, social status, phenotypic condition, and/or genetic quality. However, animals often have incentives to lie about their own qualities, to attract more mates, solicit more parental investment, or deter more predators and rivals. Costly signaling theory offers a solution to this problem of lying. If a signal is so costly that only high health, high status, high condition animals can afford to produce it, the signal can remain evolutionarily reliable. Almost any fitness-related cost will work: matter, energy, time, or risk. For example, a peacock's tail is burdensome in all 4 senses. Its growth and maintenance require several hundred grams of mass, many calories, much time to grow, and much risk. Its costs undermine immunocompetence and parasite resistance. Often, the most complex, elaborate, and puzzling signals observed in nature are the result of sexual selection through mate choice, as Darwin argued back in 1871. These sexual ornaments almost always impose high costs on the bearer, guaranteeing their reliability as indicators of condition and fitness. This paper argues that many human virtues evolve through sexual selection as costly signals. This hypothesis has been advanced by a few previous researchers, such as Darwin and Zahavi, and its empirical testing has been one of the most active areas of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology in the last few years. Indeed, many pro-social behaviors that were assumed to arise through kinship or reciprocity are now thought to have emerged as costly signals of individual fitness, favored by social and sexual selection. For example, it was often assumed that risky big-game hunting evolved because the best hunters could better feed their own offspring. However, most hunted meat from big game is distributed too widely in hunter-gatherer clans for this paternal provisioning theory to work. Rather, recent research suggests that the most successful hunters who provide the prosocial public good of hunted meat also tend to attract more high-quality female mates. Meat provisioning may not be a conscious sexual strategy and may not even be the causal mediator of good hunters' increased reproductive success. Good hunting and high attractiveness may both be caused by an underlying trait such as high genetic quality. Nevertheless, such research raises the possibility that altruistic meat provisioning was favored, at least in part, by sexual selection. Likewise, our mate preferences for other moral virtues may be explained by costly signaling theory. If a young woman places a singles ad stating "Chef 26 seeks kind, generous, romantic, honest man," we might translate this in evolutionary terms as single Hispanic female 26 seeks a healthy male of breeding age with a minimal number of personality disorders that would impair efficient coordination and parenting in a sustained sexual relationship, and a minimal number of deleterious mutations on the thousands of genes that influence the development of brain systems for costly, conspicuous, altruistic displays of moral virtue. Of course, this hypothetical singles ad itself is not good psychological evidence or a costly signal in its own right. It is cheap and easy to fake. Rather, the ad identifies some desired moral virtues that would be hard to fake consistently during a lengthy courtship. Good genes, good parents, and good partners. Sexually selected costly signals typically advertise two classes of traits: good genes or good parenting abilities. Different moral virtues might advertise one or the other, or both. They might also advertise the capacity to be a good partner in a long-term sexual relationship, someone reliable, trustworthy, adaptable, agreeable, and efficient at coordinating joint activities. Good genes indicators advertise general genetic quality, which probably reflects having a low mutation load, fewer than average errors in DNA replication. By favoring mates with a lower than average number of harmful mutations, sexually reproducing organisms can increase the expected survival and reproductive prospects of their offspring, even if their mate contributes nothing as a parent after fertilization. Moral virtues may function as good genes indicators by being difficult to display impressively if one has a high mutation load that impairs the precision of body and brain development. For example, displaying a sophisticated, empathetic social intelligence requires the development of a complex theory of mind, which might be easily disrupted by a variety of mutations associated with autism, schizophrenia, mental retardation, social anxiety, and language impairments. Thus, a conspicuously expert level of empathy may function as a sort of neurogenetic guarantee. For moral virtues to function as good genes indicators, they must show at least moderate degrees of genetic variance, heritability, and positive genetic correlations with other fitness-related traits. By contrast, good parent indicators advertise phenotypic traits that help care for offspring, such as feeding them, grooming them to remove parasites, protecting them from predators, resolving sibling rivalries, and teaching life skills through play and practice. So a genuinely empathic personality may also function as a good parent guarantee, testifying to the likely patience, kindness, protectiveness, playfulness, and conscientiousness that helps children thrive. For moral virtues to function as good parent indicators, they need not show genetic variance, heritability, or genetic correlations with other fitness-related traits. They need only show reliable phenotypic correlations with parenting-relevant abilities. Finally, good partner indicators advertise phenotypic traits that promote efficient coordination and high mutual benefits in long-term sexual relationships. In game theory terms, such relationships, such as marriages, are iterated, mixed-motive games with very complex conflicts and confluences of interest, many possible equilibria, and incomplete information about the other player's possible tactics and preferences. Some of a potential mate's moral virtues could function as signals that maximize one's payoffs and minimize one's risks in such relationship games. For example, moral capacities for conscientiousness and patience may signal a partner's likelihood of playing mutually beneficial strategies given the iterated, repeated interaction nature of long-term relationships. Moral capacities for empathy and sympathy may signal that a partner attaches positive utility to one's own happiness in addition to their own, which makes it much more likely that a Pareto optimal, mutually beneficial equilibrium will be maintained in the relationship. A moral preference for romantic commitment over violent aggression may signal that a partner will seek to sustain a cooperative relationship through promises rather than threats. In each case, the moral trait as a good partner indicator may seem intuitively attractive for its own sake, since conscientious, empathic, committed partners just make life easier. However, as noted earlier, whenever there are incentives to act like a better partner during courtship than after reproduction, the problem of trait stability arises. Mate preferences for human moral virtues, whether as good genes, good parent, or good partner indicators, may have originated in other social preferences concerning kin selection, reciprocal altruism, social commitment, progeny choice, or other domains. For example, psychological adaptations for detecting, remembering, and avoiding cheaters in the domain of social reciprocity could have been extended, exapted, to the domain of mate choice as a preference for the moral virtues of honesty and reliability. Indeed, mate preferences for moral virtues may have originated as non-functional byproducts of these other social preferences and would have been more appropriately analyzed using receiver bias models rather than costly signaling models of sexual selection. However, given the central adaptive importance of mate choice, it seems likely that such non-functional preferences would have been rapidly eliminated if they had net fitness costs, or modified and specialized for adaptive mate choice if they had net fitness benefits. Sexually selected signals and sex differences. From a costly signaling perspective, sexual selection is not restricted to explaining sex differences. It can also explain sexual similarities, non-dimorphism, in extravagant traits when mutual mate choice is at work. Humans are unusual among mammals in showing intensive offspring care by both mothers and fathers, which favors roughly equal levels of male and female mate choice for long-term socially monogamous relationships. This has resulted in low dimorphism physical ornamentation in humans, such as long head hair, relatively hairless bodies, and averted lips, and low dimorphism psychological ornamentation, such as cognitive abilities for language, art, music, humor, and ideology. Thus, a sexual selection account of moral virtues does not imply that males evolve all the conspicuous virtues and females play the passive role of virtue assessment. Given mutual choice, both human sexes should show conspicuous, sexually attractive moral virtues during mate attraction and retention. However, human males face higher variance in reproductive success, so are predicted to allocate somewhat more energy, time, and risk to mating effort, including costly, dangerous public displays of moral virtue. For example, this model naturally explains why males are overrepresented among pro-social heroes who risk their lives to save unrelated strangers. It may also explain why males remain overrepresented in high-risk, underpaid, altruistic, romantically attractive professions such as the police, fire, and military services, whereas women remain overrepresented in low physical risk, underpaid, altruistic, romantically attractive professions such as nursing and school teaching. The biased sex ratios in these high-risk versus low-risk professions are undoubtedly influenced by social norms regarding gender, danger, and sex roles. Nonetheless, human gender norms seem unlikely to be the whole explanation, given the cross-species ubiquity of sex differences in risk-taking, and the evidence that human sex differences in risk-taking are largely mediated by sex differences in personality traits, such as sensation-seeking, aggressiveness, and extroversion, rather than gender roles concerning risk per se. More generally, sexual selection is probably relevant somehow whenever there are cross-culturally stable sex differences in the display or judgment of human moral virtues. By contrast, most traditional theories of human moral evolution through kinship, reciprocity, group selection, and equilibrium selection are sex-blind. Therefore, they have trouble accounting for any observed sex differences in the means, variances, heritabilities, genetic correlations, and life history profiles of specific quantifiable moral virtues and any associated social, political, or religious attitudes. Evaluating moral persons versus moral acts. Costly signaling theory portrays human moral actions in a new light as reliable cues of personal moral traits. This may seem a peculiar idea to most moral philosophers who have traditionally focused on judging the morality of isolated acts rather than the moral virtues of whole people. Recently, as act ethics has been supplanted by virtue ethics, attention has returned to the moral person level of description, just the right level of description to consider in costly signaling models of moral evolution. It is the level that unifies the study of quantitative traits in evolutionary genetics, mate choice in evolutionary psychology, person perception in social psychology, personality traits in behavior genetics, parole decisions in criminal justice, and voter choice in democratic elections. It seems unlikely that our prehistoric ancestors made moral judgments about isolated behavioral acts. Rather, as in other domains of person perception, they probably interpreted the behavioral acts as cues of stable individual traits, virtues, or vices. In small-scale hunter-gatherer bands, morality came in person-sized units, not act-sized units. Ancestral hominids had to choose their lovers, friends, and allies as integrated moral packages: good or bad, hero or villain, lover or stalker, reciprocator or cheat. Moreover, it would not make adaptive sense to judge isolated moral acts in tightly knit prehistoric social groups. Individual actions must be assessed in the context of individual qualities, such as age, sex, status, physical health, mental health, personality, intelligence, and genetic relatedness. We tolerate theft by our own toddlers more than theft by unrelated adults. We forgive unkind words spoken during high fevers by the sick. We do not expect a keenly empathic theory of mind in the severely brain-damaged or autistic. Also, individual actions must be assessed in the context of ongoing relationships, as different social interaction domains call for different moral judgment criteria focused on different virtues. We may favor kindness and fidelity more in mate choice, honesty and conscientiousness more in reciprocity, and genetic similarity, residual reproductive value, and gratitude more in kin-directed altruism. This is why mothers can love psychopathic sons. Only in social reciprocity with unrelated acquaintances do we see the tit-for-tat moral accounting that corresponds to traditional act ethics. The moral person and moral act levels of description show some other key differences relevant to this mate choice model. First, morality means something different at the person level compared to the act level. A moral act may be one that obeys some rationally defensible, universalizable, deontic, or consequentialist principle. However, a moral person, from the point of view of a standard prehistoric hunter-gatherer, is someone who embodies pro-social virtues that make them a good mate, friend, relative, or trading partner. In evolutionary terms, a moral person is simply one who pursues their ultimate genetic self-interest through psychological adaptations that embody a genuine, proximate concern for others. Second, the moral person level emphasizes that perceived moral virtue is an emergent property of interaction between the moral judgment maker and the morally judged. Just as beauty arises from the sexual ornaments of the displayer interacting with the perceptual adaptations of the beholder. Beauty is neither subjective nor objective, but what one could call objectively relational. It is a real emergent property of a costly signaling system, including both ornaments and preferences. Likewise, for moral virtues in this mate choice model, the morality emerges from the interaction of traits and preferences. By contrast, the moral act level of description tends to downplay the role of the observer in making moral judgments, pretending that there can be direct contact between a moral act to be judged and a universal normative principle such as Kant's categorical imperative or Mill's utilitarian principle. Finally, we generally accept that ought implies can when we judge moral acts. We don't expect the poor to donate to charity or quadriplegics to jump in front of trolleys to save children. They can't do the moral thing, so we don't expect them to. However, when judging the morality of whole persons in real relationships, we are rarely so forgiving. If a potential mate has Tourette's syndrome and can't refrain from screaming, "Psycho prick," repeatedly during a public first date, there is unlikely to be a second date, no matter how much we understand about verbal disinhibition in neurological disorders. If a potential hunting partner had a severe head injury, that renders him too clumsy to hunt effectively, we may pity him, but will still resentfully exclude him from the hunt. When the fitness stakes are high, we hold people morally accountable, even for faults that are not their own. Moral culpability is a slippery idea, since everyone must be a joint product of their genes, their environment, and random developmental events. If our ancestors couldn't ostracize helplessly evil people, they couldn't have protected themselves from serial rapist psychopaths or hot-tempered murderers. Romantic virtues and moral virtues. This sexual selection model may appear bizarre at first to moral philosophers and moral psychologists. From St. Augustine through Sigmund Freud, sexuality has been viewed as morality's nemesis. When Western thought was gripped by the traditional dichotomies of body versus spirit, lust versus virtue, and sinners versus saints, it was hard to imagine that moral virtues might arise through mate choice. Even within evolutionary theories of morality, moral capacities are usually seen as efficient tactics to increase individual or group survival prospects, rather than as costly, conspicuous signals to increase individual reproductive prospects. To overcome these intellectual biases, it may help to take a step back and think about the role of moral virtues in real human mate choice. Apart from physical appearance and social status, which traits most excite our romantic impulses? People often fall in love based on positive assessments of each other's generosity, kindness, honesty, courage, social sensitivity, political idealism, intellectual integrity, empathy to children, respectfulness to parents, or loyalty to friends. The most romantic personal traits are often those that have been considered praiseworthy moral virtues by the world's most influential philosophical and religious traditions from ancient Greece, Israel, Arabia, India, China, and Japan. These lovable virtues include not only the traditional prosocial virtues of European Christendom, such as faith, hope, charity, love, kindness, fairness, equality, humility, and conscience, but also Friedrich Nietzsche's pagan virtues, such as leadership, bravery, strength, skill, health, fertility, beauty, tolerance, joy, humor, and grace. Courtship as a moral obstacle course. Moral virtues are, among other things, personal traits that we are proud to display during courtship. Indeed, courtship in most cultures can be viewed as a moral obstacle course, a ritualized test of diverse moral virtues, such as kindness in gift-giving, conscientiousness in keeping promises, empathy in listening, and sexual self-control. For courtship to be reliable, valid, and discriminating as a moral test, it must lead to a perceivable range of moral failures, such as broken promises, revealed prejudices, irritabilities, infidelities, impatient sexual pressures that reflect an underlying population distribution of moral traits. In archetypal romance stories across cultures, both characters fall in love, enjoy bliss, get lazy, make some moral errors, have a moral crisis, recognize their moral failures, resolve to improve their moral character, magnanimously forgive each other, and live happily ever after. It is not romantic for characters to make and forgive purely perceptual failures, such as failures of depth perception or color constancy, or purely cognitive failures, such as base rate neglect or hindsight bias. If neither individual in a sexual relationship cares about projecting moral virtues, as in relations between prostitutes and clients or masters and slaves, then the relationship is considered superficial and unloving. Subjectively, romantic emotions seem to amplify the perceived variance in moral character across potential lovers. When we fall in love, new lovers seem morally exemplary. When they make moral errors, they seem morally treacherous. When they make amends, they seem morally redeemed. When they divorce us, they seem morally repulsive. Borderline personality disorder, the tendency to view intimate partners in unstable, dichotomized ways as alternately extremely good or extremely evil, is just an exaggerated form of the normal human tendency to alternately overvalue and undervalue our lovers' virtues. Of course, such emotions may not increase the objective accuracy of moral information, in the sense of more accurate perceptual discrimination of moral traits across individuals, but they may increase the salience of such information, its accessibility to other brain systems for attention, memory, decision-making, language, and motor behavior. Conversely, moral vices are character flaws that we would be embarrassed to reveal to potential mates. These sexually embarrassing vices include not just obviously antisocial behaviors, killing, raping, lying, cheating, but also victimless addictions, sloth, gluttony, greed, envy, pride, drinking, smoking, drug taking, gambling, masturbating, failures of prosocial magnanimity, under-tipping waiters, ignoring starving children, fleeing combat, and acts of symbolic meanness, kicking toys, burning books, spitting on tombs. This may sound like an odd grab bag of crimes, sins, foibles, and insanities from most traditional viewpoints, evolutionary altruism theories, law, religion, psychiatry. However, from a virtue ethics viewpoint, and from the sexual signaling viewpoint of this article, these moral vices have an important common denominator. They lead potential mates to hold our moral character in lower esteem, so they are less likely to breed with us. Also, the leading causes of divorce across cultures, infidelity, abuse, addiction, unemployment, are almost all seen as serious moral failures. To moral philosophers, the sexual costs of moral vice may seem tangential to human moral evolution. Yet to evolutionary biologists, a direct connection between moral vice and impaired reproductive success should be highly suggestive. Courtship generosity. The moral virtues most readily explained by sexual selection are those most conspicuously manifest in sexual courtship and relationships, and consistently valued in mate choice across cultures. Courtship generosity is the most obvious example, with clear parallels to courtship feeding by animals, in which nuptial gifts are given by males to females as good genes indicators and good parent investments. Human courtship generosity would include altruism, kindness, and sympathy to the sexual partner, to his or her children from previous relationships, one's stepchildren, and to his or her family members, one's in-laws. Since this sort of courtship generosity is directed at non-relatives and is not expected to be reciprocated, it is hard to explain through kin selection or reciprocal altruism, and it qualifies as evolutionary altruism by traditional definitions. Courtship generosity may even include much of the paternal effort that is usually assumed to arise through kin selection, where kin include offspring, since most divorced fathers reduce their paternal investment as soon as they are cut off from sexual access to mothers. Thus, what looks like simple paternal investment in one's offspring may turn out to be better described as ongoing courtship generosity by males to maintain sexual access to the mothers of those offspring. Under ancestral small group conditions, it may have been perfectly clear which males cut off aid to their children after breaking up with their mothers. Such males may have been considered immoral and selfish, and may have suffered reputational and reproductive costs as a result. However, depending on the exact social context and social norms, those moral costs may have been lower than the net fitness costs of continued paternal investment without sexual access to the mother. Here, as with all complex psychological adaptations, recognition of such situational contingencies is not hand-waving. It can lead to precise, testable predictions about the social, cultural, and economic conditions under which males will continue paternal investment following relationship termination. Moral and quasi-moral traits in individual differences psychology. Some of the best studied individual differences dimensions in psychology have moral or quasi-moral status when they are assessed in social and sexual interaction. These include personality traits, mental health traits, and intelligence. These heritable dimensions of individual variation are morally valenced, and their morally praiseworthy extremes increase sexual attractiveness. These traits are interrelated not because they share some abstract set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but because, in the real world, they tend to be disrupted by the same kinds of pleiotropic genetic mutations, developmental errors, and neuropsychological abnormalities. Personality traits. Current research on personality traits is dominated by the Big Five model, which identifies 5 key personality traits that can be reliably measured, that validly predict diverse behaviors, that are stable across the lifespan, and that replicate across cultures. These traits can be remembered with the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Of these, conscientiousness and agreeableness are most strongly sought in long-term mates, and best predict good partner traits and good parent traits, so are most likely to have been shaped as moral virtues by sexual selection. Conscientiousness implies fulfilling promises, respecting commitments, and resisting bad habits. It subsumes individual differences in industriousness, self-control, responsibility, and several other virtues. It predicts emotional maturity, romantic lovability in relationships, and not killing people by driving safely. It also predicts pro-social civic and organizational engagement and honesty, integrity, dependability, trustworthiness, and reliability at work. Further, conscientiousness positively predicts virtually every health-related behavior that increases longevity, including eating a healthy diet, exercising, and avoiding tobacco, excessive alcohol, addictive drugs, risky sexual behavior, risky driving, and suicide. Conscientiousness is also closely related to the capacity for willpower, self-control, and delay of gratification, which are key virtues across many sociosexual domains. Prefrontal brain damage, as in the famous case of Phineas Gage, tends to reduce conscientiousness and disinhibits impulsive antisocial behavior, so it reduces both moral virtue and long-term sexual attractiveness. Agreeableness implies warmth, kindness, sympathy, and non-aggressiveness. It predicts benevolence and respect for moral traditions, the quality and peacefulness of social relationships, and success in jobs requiring teamwork and social interaction. Gentle, agreeable behavior fits the tend and befriend response to stress that is favored by female social primates. Individuals who score low on agreeableness tend to have more personality disorders. They also tend to be aggressive, arrogant, conceited, domineering, narcissistic, and lacking in empathy, usually considered moral vices. Since agreeableness increases satisfaction and stability in sexual relationships, as in other social relationships, it is probably valued especially as a good parent and good partner indicator. The other three of the big five traits, openness, extroversion, and neuroticism, are more morally ambiguous and tend to result in assortative mating through preferences for self-similarity. For example, high openness, interest in novel experiences, aesthetics, and culture, predicts the moral virtues of emotional sensitivity, social tolerance, political liberalism, and support for universalist values, the sort that would be supported by Kant's categorical imperative. On the other hand, low openness predicts the moral virtues of temperance, chastity, stoicism, community solidarity, pride in one's people and traditions, and clarity of gender role, manliness or femininity, which academics tend to label vices, right-wing authoritarianism, racism, sexism. The strong assortative mating for political and religious attitudes, reflecting each point along the openness dimension, suggests that sexual selection may have amplified variance in openness, but is unlikely to have pushed it consistently in either direction. Are personality traits such as conscientiousness and agreeableness really relevant to the evolution of morality? Moral philosophers have lately rediscovered the old social psychology critiques of personality psychology, as in the person versus situation debate, and work on the fundamental attribution error. Social psychology's concern was that apparently stable personality traits may not really exist, but may be projections of a biased social attribution system. Citing this literature, some researchers argued that virtue ethics cannot succeed because social psychology shows there are no stable personality traits that could correspond to virtues. Unfortunately, virtue ethicists have not usually responded to these critiques on empirical grounds. By citing the well-established reliability, validity, stability, and heritability of personality traits, which have been established across cultures and even across species. Mental health traits. All major mental illnesses tend to increase perceived selfishness and to decrease perceived moral virtue, sexual attractiveness, and social status. This seems especially true for the most common and severe psychopathologies, such as depression, schizophrenia, and psychopathy. Many personality disorders, such as paranoid, narcissistic, and borderline disorders, also predict antisocial behavior. Signs of mental illness typically lead to social and sexual rejection by others, i.e., to stigmatization through negative social attributions. Serious mental illness almost always reduces reproductive success by reducing sexual attractiveness. Indeed, as I've argued in our Mating Intelligence book, many mental disorders can be viewed as catastrophic failures of mating intelligence, of the cognitive and motivational systems that allow normal individuals to display moral virtues, verbal creativity, and social savvy in courtship. Severe mental disorders disrupt moral virtues, but they disrupt almost everything else too: education, employment, relationships, hygiene. Do less severe, more common mental disorders, such as personality disorders, have especially harmful effects on sexually preferred moral virtues? Many of them seem to, and have highly sex-skewed prevalence rates that suggest some involvement of sexual selection in their evolutionary etiology. Asperger syndrome, a milder, much more common version of autism, is a highly male-biased condition characterized by serious deficits in social empathy and communication that result in pervasive, consistent problems in attracting, retaining, and understanding sexual partners. Narcissistic personality disorder, extreme arrogance, grandiosity, self-involvement, and showing off, reflects obsessive overinvestment in conspicuous, public fitness displays to attract multiple short-term mates. Antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, a pervasive, highly male-biased pattern of callous, exploitative, impulsive, violent, and promiscuous behavior, can be construed as over-reliance on deceptive, coercive, and short-term mating tactics. Borderline personality disorder, a highly female-biased pattern of promiscuity, relationship instability, drug and alcohol abuse, risky driving, and impulsive behavior, is associated with many vices. All of these personality disorders seriously reduce long-term mating success, relationship satisfaction, and marital stability, and they have fairly high prevalence rates in the general population. Thus, the study of mental disorders and their effects on intimate relationships is highly relevant to understanding moral virtues and vices and their possible origins through mate choice. Intelligence. Intelligence, in the sense of general cognitive ability or the G factor, as measured by IQ tests, is a morally valenced concept. This is why it has been so controversial throughout a century of psychometrics, ever since the groundbreaking work by Charles Spearman in 1904. It is well established that intelligence predicts objective performance and learning ability across all important life domains that show reliable individual differences. Based on thousands of psychometric studies, almost all reputable intelligence researchers agree that the best single measure of intelligence is the G factor, a dimension of general cognitive ability, which can be statistically extracted from any reasonably diverse battery of reliable cognitive tests given to any reasonably large sample of people. Less well appreciated is that higher intelligence predicts many behaviors that we consider morally virtuous, such as being emotionally sensitive to the needs of others, working conscientiously, staying healthy through exercise and diet, and staying happily married. Intelligence also predicts many forms of social, economic, and aesthetic success that are sexually attractive and morally valenced, including creativity, artistic virtuosity, and achieving social status and wealth through individual merit. These moral correlates of intelligence may be one reason why intelligence is so attractive when both men and women consider potential long-term partners. Conversely, lower intelligence predicts many behaviors considered morally wrong, such as murder, rape, assault, alcoholism, drug addiction, absenteeism, child abuse, and neglect, passing along sexually transmissible infections and causing fatal traffic accidents. Many lines of research, from longitudinal studies to multivariate genetic studies, suggest that intelligence is not just correlated with these diverse traits and behaviors, but that in each case, intelligence is either causally primary or intelligence and the other trait are driven by an underlying dimension of genetic quality. One might object that intelligence is not really a moral virtue, it just happens to predict a wide range of specific moral behaviors. Yet, what is a moral virtue, if not an individual differences dimension that predicts a wide range of specific moral behaviors? Moral virtues are socially attributed traits that carry predictive information about morally relevant behaviors. If kindness is a moral virtue because it predicts specific prosocial behaviors and is valued as such, then intelligence must also be a moral virtue, besides being an academic, economic, and epistemological virtue. Another reason for accepting the quasi-moral status of intelligence is the recent convergence between virtue ethics and virtue epistemology, the study of cognitive and intellectual virtues. Traditional epistemology tried to evaluate the truth of particular conceptual systems through consistency and coherence criteria. By contrast, for the virtue epistemologist, true beliefs arise from acts of intellectual virtue, acts typical of intelligent, rational, cognitively complex agents who show impartiality, epistemic responsibility, and intellectual courage. For example, Aristotle named intuition, wisdom, prudence, and science as intellectual virtues. In virtue epistemology, as in virtue ethics, the favored level of description is the whole individual as a cognitive moral agent, not the isolated belief or moral act. This naturally leads to an emphasis on individual differences in epistemological virtue, differences that intelligence researchers have already succeeded in measuring with unparalleled reliability and validity for over a century. Thus, intelligence is a sexually attractive, quasi-moral trait at the intersection of virtue epistemology and virtue ethics. Are these traits really judged as moral virtues? In what sense do these personality, mental health, and cognitive traits have a quasi-moral status? There are at least 4 reasons to think they do, 3 from social psychology and 1 from popular culture. First, most people show a just world belief that creativity, beauty, status, and wealth are merited by those who enjoy them, as both causes and consequences of moral virtue. People judge these traits as morally valenced and morally correlated. Second, research using the implicit association test shows that many dimensions judged in person perception are highly evaluative and load on a common good bad dimension that confounds moral goodness, likability, pleasantness, status, racial similarity, and physical attractiveness. Third, there is a powerful halo effect around such traits, so they are judged as boosting the likely moral virtues of judged individuals. For example, defendants in criminal cases who are more physically attractive, high in occupational status, and wealthy are more likely to be acquitted or given lighter sentences by juries of their often lower status peers. Conversely, information that a person is morally virtuous boosts ratings of their health and physical attractiveness. Some halo effects may reflect accurate inferences about genuinely correlated traits, true halo, rather than perceiver bias, halo error. In each case, people conflate moral virtues with personality traits, mental health, intelligence, and physical attractiveness. Finally, the popular culture reason. People often attribute these quasi-moral traits in exaggerated form to mythical beings who have strong moral valences, such as gods, patriarchs, political leaders, movie characters, and comic book superheroes. In religion, believers typically credit benevolent deities with supernatural levels of the quasi-moral personality traits, intelligence, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability, as well as the standard sexually selected fitness indicators, size, strength, status, beauty, longevity. In monotheistic religions, these traits are bundled together. In polytheistic religions, such as ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Aztec pantheons, different supernormal traits are attributed to different deities. Contemporary fantasy films and comic books show the standard polytheistic pattern, with different supernormal, quasi-moral traits attributed to different superheroes. Ever since Socrates, philosophy has tried to develop precise distinctions between theoretical constructs that are often empirically correlated. Most philosophers think in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, not in terms of factor analysis. Thus, moral philosophers may balk at such flagrantly irrational conflations of moral goodness, social reputation, economic power, and sexual attractiveness. Indeed, they may be tempted to quote a cautionary verse from Ogden Nash. It's always tempting to impute unlikely virtues to the cute. But moral philosophers did not drive the genetic evolution of human virtues. Ordinary folks did. If we are seeking a descriptive explanation for human morality, we should attend to the person-perception judgments that may have causally driven moral evolution in our species. Ultimately, it is an empirical question whether ordinary folks judge these traits to have a moral or quasi-moral status when making social and sexual judgments about others. Are the moral virtues really sexually attractive? Research shows that many particular moral virtues are sexually attractive and relationship stabilizing. These include kindness, empathy, niceness, honesty, and heroism. Most of these moral virtue preferences are stronger when seeking a serious long-term partner than a short-term lover. Others, such as the preference for risky, pro-social heroism, may be stronger when females are seeking a short-term male partner. The problem is that these studies so far cannot distinguish whether the moral virtues are preferred because they signal good genes, good parents, and/or good partners. As with most mate choice research, the first step is to demonstrate a preference that could drive selection for a signaling trait. The second step is to clarify why the preference exists, which often demands more nuanced, more experimental research methods. For example, if a certain moral virtue signals mainly genetic quality rather than parent or partner quality, it should be most preferred by women just before ovulation, within each monthly cycle, when it could be passed along to offspring. Likewise, good genes, moral virtues, should be more preferred in short-term sexual liaisons and extra-pair copulations than in long-term relationships. Conversely, good parent and good partner virtues should be more preferred by women at less fertile cycle phases and in longer-term relationships. Much more research is needed along these lines. What about cross-cultural differences in moral norms and mate preferences for virtues? The cross-cultural studies of mate preferences cited above raise the question: if some moral virtues are species-typical, sexually selected indicators, why do we see large cross-cultural differences in some moral norms and behaviors? Here again, the virtue ethics framework helps clarify different levels of analysis. I suspect that individuals from every culture tend to value intelligence, mental health, and emotional stability as moral virtues in potential mates, but that radically different behaviors can be used to demonstrate these traits in different social, cultural, economic, and ecological contexts. The two largest cross-cultural studies of mate preferences were coordinated by David Buss in 1989 and by David Schmidt in 2004. Buss and his collaborators asked 10,047 people from 37 cultures to rate and rank order the desirability of several traits in a sexual partner. Among the top 10 traits most desired by both men and women across almost all cultures were kindness, intelligence, exciting personality, adaptability, creativity, chastity, and beauty. Each of these has at least quasi-moral status in many cultures. Schmidt and collaborators gathered data on 17,804 people from 62 cultures and found similarly close links between morality and mate choice. Across most cultures, sexual promiscuity, infidelity, and mate poaching were predicted by low agreeableness and low conscientiousness. Also, many studies show that singles ads across cultures often advertise and seek moral traits, especially kindness, generosity, honesty, fidelity, and capacity for commitment. Ideally, further research would examine cross-cultural preferences for moral virtues using more subtle, indirect, ecologically valid measures, such as revealed preferences in fast dating parties for real singles, rather than stated preferences on questionnaires and in singles ads, which may be biased by strategic self-presentation and adaptive self-deception. Sexual selection and equilibrium selection. An especially interesting, powerful, and neglected interaction may occur between sexual selection and group-level equilibrium selection. Many evolutionary games have multiple equilibria, states where each player is maximizing their individual payoffs given the strategies already played by others. Some equilibria are better for everybody. They bring net positive payoffs to everyone. They are Pareto dominant. Some equilibria are worse for everybody, Pareto inferior, but cannot be escaped easily because individuals who deviate from the equilibrium do even worse. Normally, natural selection alone is not very good at escaping from such Pareto inferior equilibria to reach Pareto dominant equilibria. Sexual selection may help by conferring reproductive benefits on individuals who deviate from selfish, antisocial equilibria. This sexual payoff for virtue is functionally similar to the social reputation payoffs for virtue modeled by other researchers. However, standard social reputation models create a second-order free rider problem, who will altruistically take the trouble to punish the wicked and reward the virtuous. As research from behavioral game theory, such as on the ultimatum game, shows most humans are emotionally compelled to impose this sort of altruistic punishment of others who act selfishly. The question is, why? Most explanations for this sort of altruistic punishment appeal to the dynamics of cultural evolution or social norms, without identifying any plausible individual fitness payoffs for punishing the wicked. By contrast, this mate choice model identifies selfish mate choice incentives, such as good gene and good parent payoffs, for rewarding the virtuously punitive with sexual relationships. That is, the effective imposition of punishment on antisocial others at substantial risks and costs to oneself should be seen as virtuous, socially status-enhancing, and hence sexually attractive, and recent research suggests that it is. Thus, individual socio-sexual payoffs for virtuous behavior can help solve the collective action problems that pervade human social life. Of course, pro-social punishers are likely to gain other costly signaling benefits, being viewed as more dominant, capable, and confident, and thus attracting more friends, allies, and support from kin. Most contemporary theories of moral evolution accept the importance of multi-level selection across the genetic, individual, and group levels, either implicitly or explicitly. Generally, group-level selection for pro-social behavior is what breaks the symmetry between alternative equilibria in evolutionary games to allow the evolution of genuine empathy and altruism. This model of sexual selection, interacting with group-level equilibrium selection, is a potent way that pro-social virtues can establish a genetic beachhead in an otherwise selfish population, long before group-level equilibrium selection can favor morally unified groups. Sexual choosiness as a moral virtue. In traditional sexual selection theory, from Darwin onwards, there is a crisp distinction between mate preference and preferred trait. However, if mate choice started to favor human sexual fidelity, chastity, and choosiness as moral virtues, the stage would be set for a new positive feedback process. Just as poor taste in one's friends and associates can reflect moral inadequacy, poor taste in one's previous mates can. Thus, in our highly social species, given capacities for observing, remembering, and gossiping about other people's sexual relationships, a conspicuously excellent capacity for mate choice could come under sexual selection as a preferred trait, perhaps even becoming a costly moral signal in its own right. The resulting evolutionary dynamics of such meta-selection, sexual selection for sexual choosiness, have not, to my knowledge, been explored. Predictions of the sexual selection model for moral virtues. Given the theoretical plausibility of so many moral evolution models, how can they be tested empirically? This sexual selection model makes many discriminating predictions. These often take an unusual form, since costly signaling adaptations have very different phenotypic and genetic features compared to other types of adaptations. In particular, many of these predictions concern individual differences in virtues. Not a common research topic in evolutionary psychology or moral philosophy, which tend to focus on species-typical moral judgments and behaviors. To test most of these predictions, one would need to develop measurement scales that can identify stable individual differences in particular kinds of moral virtues, and that fulfill standard psychometric criteria for reliability and validity. To discriminate between rival theories concerning the evolutionary origins and adaptive functions of specific human virtues, we need to assess the adaptive design features of each putative virtue in reliably quantitative ways. This will require much more psychometrically sophisticated approaches to virtue ethics, not just asking people to give answers to a few multiple-choice trolley problems from moral philosophy. Generally, sexually selected virtues, as quantified in this way, should show most of the following 12 features. No one feature alone is strong evidence for the mate choice model. However, these features are highly discriminating when used in combination, as they would not be expected from most other models of moral evolution through other selection pressures, such as kin selection, reciprocity, group selection, especially those that implicitly depend on stabilizing rather than directional selection. This list is intended mainly to help discriminate between different macromodels of moral evolution, such as sexual selection versus kin selection, reciprocity, and group selection, although certain criteria are also helpful in discriminating different micromodels within the sexual selection framework, such as virtues evolved as good genes indicators, good parent indicators, or good partner indicators. Genetic features of moral virtues. 1. Positive heritability. If virtues are good genes indicators, they should prove genetically heritable in twin and adoption studies, with substantial additive genetic variance maintained by polygenic mutation selection balance. Many studies report substantial heritability for various forms of antisocial behavior and its personality correlates, such as psychopathy, sensation-seeking, and disagreeableness. Moderate heritability for altruism, empathy, nurturance, and/or responsibility has been found in a few twin studies. Also, if virtues are costly and evolved under sexual selection, the genes underlying virtues should also show a distinctive life history of heritability and become more expressed only after sexual maturity, perhaps in response to sex hormones. This should lead to higher heritability of virtues in adults than in children, as has been found with intelligence. On the other hand, if virtues are mainly good parent and good partner indicators, they may show low heritability, though they should still show a distinctive life history that reflects the shifting costs and benefits of producing good parent-partner indicators, depending on whether one is sexually immature, mature but unmated, or mated securely. 2. Genetic inbreeding and paternal age effects. If virtues are good genes indicators, heritable variation in virtues should reflect variation in overall mutation load. For example, the offspring of sibling or cousin marriages should show reduced virtue levels due to the increased expression of harmful homozygous mutations, also known as inbreeding depression. Also, since mutation load in sperm increases gradually as men age, younger fathers should, all else being equal, sire more virtuous children. Such paternal age effects have been shown for various virtue-reducing mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia and autism. Future research could use similar methods to investigate other virtues more directly. 3. Elusive molecular genetic basis. Specific virtue-reducing alleles should be maintained mostly by mutation selection balance. Thus, virtue-reducing alleles should be mostly of fairly recent evolutionary origin, recent, harmful mutations that have not yet been eliminated by sexual selection in particular breeding populations. Thus, despite the heritability of specific virtues as found in twin and adoption studies, it should be extremely difficult to find specific virtue genes that replicate across human groups using standard linkage and association studies. Rather than finding virtue genes, molecular geneticists should find mostly vice genes, lineage-specific, evolutionarily transient, rare, recent mutations that decrease virtue rather than common haplotypes that increase virtue. Phenotypic features of moral virtues. 4. Conspicuous courtship display. During courtship, individuals should conspicuously, if unconsciously, display virtues to the opposite sex. This could be measured across different timescales, comparing courtship to non-courtship situations across different ovulation cycle stages, relationship stages, and social contexts. For example, priming people to think about potential romantic situations increases their displays of conspicuous benevolence and heroism, as it does for displays of conspicuous creativity and conspicuous consumption. Good genes virtues should be selectively displayed more in short-term, opportunistic, or extra-pair mating. Good parent-partner virtues should be displayed relatively more in long-term mating. 5. Condition-dependent costs and positive correlations with other fitness indicators. Virtues should incur a significant cost to produce in energy, time, risk, or nutritional resources. Technically, they should incur a significant relative marginal cost. Without the condition dependence requirement, this feature sounds tautological, insofar as altruistic virtues always imply evolutionary costs. With the condition dependence requirement, though, we can make more specific falsifiable predictions. For example, individuals with higher genetic fitness or better phenotypic condition should be better able to bear the costs of conspicuous moral virtues as good genes indicators, so should more often display those virtues. Thus, good genes virtues should correlate positively with other well-established fitness indicators, such as physical health, mental health, longevity, fertility, body size, body symmetry, and intelligence. In particular, there should be genuine phenotypic correlations between good genes' virtues, physical attractiveness, social status, charisma, etc., not just stereotyped halo effects in which more physically attractive people are seen as virtuous. By contrast, moral virtues as good parent-partner indicators may derive their temporal reliability from early courtship to long-term relationship, not so much from condition dependence as from the endogenous stability and increasing heritability of personality traits across the lifespan, the social reputational costs of moral backsliding, and the ever-looming threat of divorce for moral degeneracy. 6. Comorbidity among vices, developmental instabilities, and brain abnormalities. If different virtue deficits, vices, reflect harmful pleiotropic mutations with partly overlapping effects, then vices should show positive genetic correlations, genetic comorbidity, with each other, especially as vices become more serious and extreme. Also, if vices reflect harmful mutations that impair normal neurodevelopment, then they should be associated with various standard brain abnormalities widely observed for other fitness-reducing behavioral traits, such as mental illness and mental retardation. Smaller cortical volume, larger ventricles, abnormal cortical lateralization, atypical localization of processing as observed in fMRI studies, and so forth. 7. Higher trait variance in males. In species that evolved with some degree of polygyny and some frequency of extra-pair copulation, the higher male variance and skew in reproductive success should favor a risk-seeking pattern of trait expression, such that male virtue levels show higher variance than female trait values. That is, there should be more conspicuously super-virtuous males, such as Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., but also more virtue-deficient males, such as Vlad the Impaler or Stalin. The proclivity of conspicuously super-virtuous males to have covert sexual affairs with many females is evidence for this mate choice model, not evidence that they were unvirtuous. 8. Young adult peak in trait expression. For sexually selected behavioral traits, conspicuous virtue displays should peak in young adulthood at the peak of mating effort. They should be low before puberty, should increase rapidly thereafter, and should decline gradually as individuals shift their time and energy from courtship to parenting. 9. Alternative mating strategies. Individuals lacking the sexually attractive virtues should more often pursue alternative mating strategies that try to circumvent mate choice by the opposite sex and mate guarding by same-sex rivals, just as animals with lower quality ornaments tend to do. This may include increased use of short-term opportunistic mating, deceptive affairs, sexual harassment, sexual stalking, and/or sexual coercion. If so, we might predict vicious cycle effects in which initially virtue-deficit individuals fail in the mating market and adopt increasingly desperate and exploitative alternative mating strategies, which further undermine their virtues. This is not a surprising prediction for behavioral ecologists, but it offers a view of sexual aggression quite different from the dominant feminist model in the social sciences: rape as a crime of patriarchal aggression, not sex, and it may lead to more effective anti-rape interventions. Mate choice for moral virtues. 10. Mate preferences. All else being equal, virtues should be favored in mate choice. They should be highly valued aspects of potential mates that individuals are motivated not just to judge passively by observation, but to probe actively by arranging various sociosexual situations that test the specific virtues of potential mates. Such virtue tests are a central plot device in sitcoms and romantic comedies. For example, a potential mate's honesty and fidelity may be tested by arranging for a same-sex friend to flirt with them and report the outcome. Further, virtues as good genes indicators should be favored more often in short-term relationships and extra-pair copulations, and by women at peak fertility near ovulation. Virtues as good parent-partner indicators should be favored more often by individuals seeking long-term relationships, by individuals who already have children from previous relationships, and by women at lower fertility phases of the ovulatory cycle. 11. Positive assortative mating. In species with social monogamy such as ours, individuals should assortatively mate with respect to virtues, because the competitive mating market should ensure that high-virtue individuals prefer each other, leaving lower-virtue individuals no choice but to settle for each other. 12. Sexual derogation and gossip about trait values. If virtues are valued in courtship, same-sex rivals should selectively derogate each other with respect to virtue deficits such as lying and cheating. Also, in social species such as ours with collective mate choice that takes into account the views of family and friends, gossip about potential mates should focus considerable attention on virtues as fitness indicators. Virtues should be praised and vices condemned, especially when people discuss potential mates for their kin and friends. This may sound tautological. What are virtues but socially praised traits? But the mate choice model can lead to more specific predictions about sex differences and relationship context effects on the sexual derogation of virtues. For example, men seeking a short-term copulation value female promiscuity as a virtue, probably under a morally palatable euphemism such as fun, liberal, or adventurous, whereas men seeking a long-term relationship value female chastity as a virtue. Thus, a clever female will derogate or gossip about a short-term sexual rival as a frigid conservative, or a long-term marriage rival as an insatiable nympho. Thus, the sexual attractiveness and moral valence of specific rival traits should reverse under predictable conditions. Example: sexual fidelity as a moral virtue. For example, suppose a researcher hypothesizes that sexual fidelity evolved by sexual selection through mutual mate choice, rather than through kin selection, reciprocal altruism, or group selection. Fidelity might minimize the spread of sexually transmissible pathogens, the risk of cuckoldry, a male investing in offspring that were sired by another male, and the costs of polygyny, a female losing investment in her own children if a male sires children by another female. How could this hypothesis be tested? It might be easiest to go in reverse order of the 12 criteria listed above. Start with mate choice for the virtue, then phenotypic features of the virtue, then genetic bases of the virtue. A first step would be to investigate mate choice for fidelity. Do surveys, interviews, and experiments show that people prefer sexually faithful mates, all else being equal? Yes, although males are attracted to promiscuous females as potential short-term mates, neither sex respects high levels of promiscuity in potential long-term mates. Also, jealousy research shows that men and women across cultures react very negatively to sexual infidelity, yet are highly motivated to discover it. Do people verbally derogate their sexual rivals for being unfaithful? Yes, moral derogation of sexual rivals, using morally charged terms such as skank, slut, or sleazeball, is a common mating tactic. Do courting people often display their likely future fidelity to potential mates? Yes, lovers typically make impassioned, adaptively self-deceptive declarations of infinite, eternal, exclusive love. If the moral trait shows most of these adaptive mating-related features, then the researcher might progress to phenotypic studies of sexual fidelity as an individual differences dimension. Are there stable individual differences in the likelihood of fidelity versus infidelity, or is infidelity driven entirely by chance and opportunity? Research on the opposite of fidelity, the personality construct of sociosexuality, interest in promiscuous, short-term, or extra-pair mating, confirms there are stable individual differences in this trait dimension. Is fidelity positively correlated with other desirable moral virtues and fitness-related traits, such as kindness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, mental health, longevity, and intelligence? This question becomes complicated since individuals of higher mate value will be sought more often for short-term, extra-pair copulations, so will be tempted by more opportunities for infidelity. Mate value and infidelity opportunities would have to be carefully statistically controlled in studies of fidelity's correlations with other moral virtues. The genetic studies of infidelity would be the hardest to perform, but often the most informative. Would twin and adoption studies show that the propensity to infidelity versus relationship stability is heritable? After controlling for overall mate value, would higher genetic inbreeding and paternal age reduce fidelity, suggesting a role for partially recessive harmful mutations in driving infidelity? Would one find positive genetic correlations between the tendency to fidelity and the mate preference for fidelity, as might be expected if there has been sexual selection for the trait? Clearly, the sexual selection hypothesis for moral virtues is eminently testable. However, it requires new ways of thinking about costly signaling and sexually selected adaptations that are well understood by evolutionary biologists, but that have been slow to permeate evolutionary psychology. In particular, evolutionary psychology still emphasizes criteria such as low cost, high efficiency, high modularity, low phenotypic variance, low heritability, and reliable development to identify psychological adaptations. These criteria are often appropriate for survival adaptations, but not for sexually attractive signals. For naturalistic moral philosophy to benefit most from recent evolutionary insights, it must not only increase its appreciation of sexual selection's power, but also expand its understanding of how to analyze costly signaling adaptations by using, refining, and expanding the 12 expected features of moral virtues listed above. Implications for normative ethics. Normative ethics is supposed to help us distinguish right from wrong and good from evil. It tries to achieve a reflective equilibrium between three things. 1. Possible universal moral principles. 2. Derived moral implications that would apply in particular situations. And 3. Human moral intuitions that react to those principles, implications, and situations. The hope is that normative ethicists can articulate a set of universal, coherent, consistent moral principles that yield intuitively acceptable moral implications across all possible situations, and that thereby embody a rational distillation of human moral sensibility. Almost all moral philosophers accept that this is the legitimate goal of normative ethics, though debates still rage between consequentialists and deontologists, act ethicists and virtue ethicists, etc. However, if moral virtues rose through sexual selection, this reflective equilibrium approach to normative ethics will probably continue to fail, as it has for 2,500 years, for at least three reasons. First, suppose human moral intuitions evolved as part of our person perception system for inferring stable, morally valenced, mating-relevant personality traits from observable behaviors. If so, moral philosophers are trying to do ethical alchemy, trying to refine unconscious, domain-specific, person perception adaptations, the base metal, into verbally articulated, domain-general, universal moral principles, the gold. This is likely to be an uphill battle. One problem is that we seem to have a dual-process system of moral judgment, as we do in so much of person perception and social attribution. Our hot moral intuitions usually precede cool moral reasoning, as Jonathan Haidt has argued. These hot moral judgments are often driven by morally judgmental emotions that figure prominently in sexual relationships, such as anger, disgust, jealousy, embarrassment, shame, and gratitude. Our moral judgments may also arise from implicit social attitudes that may be very hard to consciously articulate into normative ethical principles. Second, if our person perception system relies on social inference heuristics that are fast, frugal, and pragmatic, then our moral judgments will often violate procedural norms of rationality derived from logic, statistics, and rational choice theory, norms such as consistency, transitivity, and completeness. There are deep decision-theoretic reasons why it may be impossible to derive a set of consistent, coherent moral preferences from the operation of such social inference heuristics. To know whether this is a fatal objection to the reflective equilibrium approach, we need to learn a lot more about moral judgment heuristics in the context of person perception research. Third, human moral intuitions evolved to assess people's stable moral virtues in ancestrally typical, fitness-relevant situations, and to guide ancestrally feasible forms of social response, such as forming friendships or mateships, gossiping about liars, punishing cheaters, or ostracizing psychopaths. There is no reason to expect our moral intuitions to show consistent, logically defensible reactions to evolutionarily novel moral dilemmas that involve isolated, hypothetical, behavioral acts by unknown strangers who cannot be rewarded or punished through any normal social primate channels. For example, we often seem cognitively paralyzed by many current debates in reproductive bioethics. How should we feel about abortion, sperm donation, egg donation, surrogate pregnancy, human cloning, genetic testing, or genetic enhancement? Different framings of these issues will activate different domain-specific moral intuitions. This is precisely why rhetorical metaphors are effective in such moral debates. For example, genetic enhancement may seem pernicious fascism if we view it as a limited resource that will be appropriated by the powerful for their nefarious ends. Or it may seem democratically liberating if we view it as a natural extension of good genes' mate choice, for those whose own suboptimal mate value precludes getting good genes from a willing partner. Is there any neutral, rational position from which we can judge such issues without assimilating them to one or another of our domain-specific moral intuitions? Probably not. Rational decision-making depends upon subjective utility functions that must be supplied either by the genetic imitation of ancestral utilities, gut instinct, or the social imitation of peer utilities, learning, social norms. Gut moral instincts will be mute or misleading guides to moral dilemmas raised by new technology, and moral conformity to peer opinion will be biased by vested political, corporate, and media interests that define the current ethical issues in their own interests. Basically, there is no compelling reason to think that our moral intuitions have any true normative credibility as guides to genuinely moral behavior. Of course, there may be evolutionary reasons to expect that species-typical human moral intuitions would tend to maximize inclusive fitness under ancestral conditions. However, that is quite different from claiming that they are normatively justifiable in any broader sense. For example, moral philosopher Peter Singer has made some rationally compelling but emotionally counterintuitive arguments about animal rights, euthanasia, and infanticide. In such cases, it seems impossible to reach a reflective equilibrium between our gut moral instincts and our scientifically informed normative judgments. This is not to say that rationally adjudicated principles of normative ethics are impossible to achieve, only that most humans are likely to find such principles emotionally uncompelling and cognitively incomprehensible. The analogy to higher mathematics may be instructive. Humans did not evolve cognitive capacities for manipulating abstract symbol systems to prove difficult mathematical theorems. Only a tiny minority of humans with extraordinarily high intelligence can do so, given years of rigorous training. When Terence Tao was awarded the 2006 Fields Medal in Mathematics for his contributions to partial differential equations, combinatorics, harmonic analysis, and additive number theory, the popular science press could not hope to convey the substance of his contributions in these areas. They could only hint at the magnitude of his genius. By mentioning that Tao was promoted to full professor at UCLA at age 24. Of course, there are a few thousand mathematicians in the world who can understand Tao's work and reach a consensus about its creativity. But to ordinary folks, good harmonic analysis work is indistinguishable from bad harmonic analysis work. Normative ethics seems likely, at best, to become a discipline like higher mathematics, a small world of like-minded geniuses pursuing consensual moral truths that remain forever beyond the moral imaginations of most humans. In the light of these problems, consider two different forms of a typical normative ethics question. Abstract form. Is it morally right to assassinate a genocidal war criminal? Perhaps many have praised the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg on July 20, 1944. Personal form. Suppose there is a 21st century head of state who ordered his country into a fraudulent and illegal war that resulted in thousands of needless civilian casualties, but who is almost certain to avoid accountability to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Is it morally right for a woman to feel sexually attracted to a man who succeeded in killing the wicked head of state with a single headshot from a Barrett M82A1 50 caliber sniper rifle at 800 meters on a windy day? The personal form is much more specific about the identities of the moral judgment maker, the morally judged individual, the civilian victims, the nature of the assassination, and the fitness-relevant socio-sexual implications of the moral judgment. These details should and do matter in making adaptive mate choice judgments about the moral virtues of snipers. A woman who knows her ordnance might admire the sniper's good genes indicators, such as his resourcefulness. The M82A1 costs $7,775 retail. His physical condition, the 13-kilogram, 145 centimeters long rifle is hard to carry, and his marksmanship, the 800-meter headshot was near the rifle's maximum effective anti-personnel range of 1,000 meters. Yet she may equally worry about his good dad indicators. His vigilante action may reveal psychopathy, paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, impulsiveness, fame-seeking narcissism, or high-risk sensation-seeking. She can only tell by gathering further information about his virtues, both moral and non-moral, which is a central function of prolonged human courtship.